So I'd like to begin today with an acknowledgement of country. I begin by respectfully acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I stand and am hosting from. In the spirit of reconciliation, NEA BPD Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples attending today. My name is Belinda and I will be your host today. I work and volunteer for NEA BPD Australia on the admin side of things, and I'm also a trained family connections leader. As you probably know, NEA BPD is a not-for-profit organisation. We deliver programs, webinars and events to support families, carers and people in relationship with someone who has BPD and or BPD traits, whether there is a formal diagnosis or not. Our main offering is the Family Connections program, which is a free evidence-based 12-week program delivering psychoeducation, skills training and support for people who are caring for or in a relationship with someone who has BPD. Today, we are lucky enough to have Dr. Skye Fitzpatrick with us all the way from Canada. Skye is an assistant professor at the Department of Psychology at York University and is a director of the TULIP Lab, which is the Treating and Understanding Life-Threatening Behaviours and Post-Traumatic Stress Lab. Today, she is presenting some of her research on the intersection of BPD and PTSD. Thank you, Skye, for making time for us and our audience over here in Australia. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I am jealous of what I believe is the warm place a lot of you are in right now. I'm in the middle of a snow and ice storm on Friday night in Canada that is so severe we're not supposed to leave our houses. So you're all very lucky to be in a warm environment right now, if you are indeed. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you all about borderline personality disorder and PTSD. So hopefully you can see my slides. And we have saved some time. I will save time, I promise, for questions at the end, as Belinda mentioned. Okay, so what am I going to do today? So I want to just briefly, I don't want to talk about myself for too long, but I'll just briefly give you some context of who I am, and then we're going to get straight into what is PTSD. I think probably a lot of folks, if you're coming here through NEA BPD, have a sense of BPD, but how do we understand PTSD and how do those things intersect with BPD? And then how do we treat it when people have both of those conditions? That's sort of my plan for today. So as Belinda said, I direct a lab in Canada called the TULIP Lab. And really what that means, it's a very long acronym, but what it essentially means, and I apologize if you hear my dogs barking in the background, they're in a bit of a rambunctious mood. So hopefully that's not too distracting. But what it really is we're just a lab that's really focused on optimizing treatments for people who have BPD, for people who have PTSD, and for people who have both of those conditions. The reason that I focus on both of those conditions is because a lot of the time people don't experience themselves as like, I have two separate disorders. They experience themselves as just tormented by emotions, by trauma, by the way that they swirl around. And it's not just the folks with those disorders who are suffering, but also their loved ones. These are two conditions in particular that are associated with a significant amount of problems in relationships. And loved ones, family members, partners, mental health and well-being can also be impacted by that. So increasingly, my research has focused on how we can leverage our relationships to both help BPD and PTSD recover, but also enhance relationship functioning and enhance family member or partner mental health and well-being all at the same time. I'm really interested in kind of these 3-for-1 treatments. And I'm also really interested in making treatments that people can actually access, because I'm sure many of you know this in Australia as well, that we have a major access issue when it comes to BPD treatment, that we have good treatments, but they're really hard to get to people. So I'm very interested in focusing on those pieces. So those are the angles that I'm coming to this topic from. And before I get too into the nitty-gritty of PTSD, I thought I'd just start with a story of one of the many folks that I've worked with this comorbidity. I'm calling her Roberta. Of course, that's not her real name, but this was a woman I met in the hospital when I was working in a hospital. And when I was there and people saw her name on the board, she had come in because she had been injured in a car accident that some people thought was intentional. I don't think that it was. It wasn't. She said it wasn't. And but she had this really horrible injury. And when people saw her, there was this staff reaction of like, oh, her again, this like real lack of compassion for seeing somebody come in after being injured because she had been at the hospital for suicidal behavior so many times. But when I spoke to her about what leads to suicide attempts, what leads to self-injury for her, it was usually flashbacks from traumatic experiences that she had. It was nightmares, it was flashbacks, it was hard to sleep because she would have trauma-related nightmares. And as a result of that, she had developed a really severe substance use problem to help her cope with those flashbacks, those reminders of traumas that she'd lived through. And then, of course, in the course of developing a substance use problem, that got so severe that unfortunately she had lost her home and was now out on the street, and in many situations that were making her more exposed to even more trauma happening to her. And it's not that that in any way was her fault, but she was at this higher risk of getting further exposed and attacked and having really difficult experiences because of her living circumstances. But as I said, for her, she was very smart. Like she could say, yeah, I have a substance use problem and this is PTSD and this is my BPD symptoms. But she was doing that and speaking that language because I was speaking that language as a psychologist. Like she doesn't experience her life as if she has three separable conditions. She experiences her life as a lot of pain and chaos that intersects with trauma and substance use and suicide attempts. They're all part of one big experience for her. And so as a researcher and a clinician, one thing that I'm often trying to do is step out of these like really clinical categories that are ultimately made by humans. We've decided where to cut the lines of these different disorders and say, okay, this is PTSD, this is BPD, and realize that a lot of folks are afflicted with these conditions that kind of swirl and dance together in a really painful way. And BPD and PTSD is a really good example of that. So, but that being said, let's talk about it like it's conditions for a sec, so we understand what we're even talking about here. So we know that over half of people with BPD get also a diagnosis of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So this is very, very common comorbidity. And that when people have both PTSD and BPD, the severity of both problems tends to be higher than if you only have one of those conditions. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of dialectical behavior therapy, which is one of our frontline treatments for BPD, which is a wonderful therapy. It really can work wonders for BPD. But it's actually not that good at treating PTSD. It's actually good at treating a lot of things. A lot of things gets better with DBT, including depression and anxiety, substance use problems as well, eating disorders. But PTSD was one of these conditions that wasn't really moving with standard DBT as it was originally designed. So that's a bit of a problem. There's one thing I'd like to say, I want to get this out of the way to get really clear on what I'm talking about here, which is this idea that trauma and PTSD, as in post-traumatic stress disorder, are not the same thing. When I'm talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, I'm talking about a specific condition that follows from trauma. Trauma is the experience of a traumatic stressor itself. And there's a lot of controversy in the field about like what counts as trauma. Some people find that debate very invalidating. I'm not really interested in that per se, but I want to make a point here because trauma impacts almost all of us. Almost all of us are going to have an experience that even by the strictest standards would be classified as a traumatic event. Most of us do not have PTSD. And so I think it's important to recognize those things as different. So what is PTSD? PTSD is a specific group of symptoms that follow in the wake of trauma. And there's four symptom groups that go into PTSD. So the first group of symptoms is called hyperarousal. The next group of symptoms is the avoidance symptoms. I call this next group the numbing symptoms, the intrusive symptoms, and they're all related to each other. And all of those symptoms impact our relationships. And our relationships feedback and impact all of those symptoms. So I want to start with the intrusive symptoms. These are the hallmark PTSD symptoms. So they're called intrusive symptoms. Sometimes they're called re-experiencing symptoms. They're called intrusive symptoms because they literally involve trauma intruding on our life. So this could be like having nightmares of a traumatic event that has happened in the past or events. Flashbacks where it feels like the trauma is happening all over again. Someone's back in the experience of the trauma. Memories of trauma coming into somebody's mind when they least expect it. They could be stressed out, but it could also happen like when somebody's bored. So these kinds of things are what we call intrusive symptoms, and those affect our relationships in all kinds of ways. So if you have a loved one who has PTSD, there's lots of ways you might start to kind of experience that too. So partners might sleep, for example, in separate beds because flashbacks or nightmares are so distressing to live through. People might find that they have to intervene when their family member has a flashback to kind of bring them back to reality. And you might find that loved ones feel distracted. You know, people with PTSD seem like they're somewhere else, maybe because they're stuck in a memory or something like that. So that's something that family members often experience. Those intrusive symptoms are highly distressing. I mean, you can imagine if you were kind of re-experiencing trauma again and again and again, how stressful that could be. And those lead to the next group of symptoms, which are called the hyperarousal symptoms. Hyperarousal is kind of what it sounds like. The mind and body are hyper or overactivated, like they're revving too high. So some symptoms we see when people have a lot of hyperarousal is like intense emotion or changes in their body at trauma reminders. So, you know, they hear a song that reminds them of a trauma that's happened to them, and all of a sudden they physiologically have like heart rate, sweating, you know, they're short of breath, or they're really, really emotional when someone mentions the name of somebody that is related to their past trauma. Another hyperarousal symptom is constantly feeling on guard. So we call this hypervigilance. This is this idea that people who have trauma feel like they're always kind of waiting for something bad to happen. People can be on guard in all kinds of ways. Folks, when they go into crowds, can feel like they're constantly scanning the crowd for signs of danger. Certainly, that's very common for like military and veteran style traumas. People can be uncomfortable turning their backs to crowded rooms or feel like they always have to sit in ways where they can see the door so they can see who's coming in and out. That sense of always being watchful for something bad happening is a hyperarousal symptom. Folks in this category also have difficulty sleeping. So insomnia, they wake up a lot, or if they wake up too early or have a hard time falling asleep. And they're also very jumpy. So a lot of the time, you know, this idea, like if you kind of snuck up by accident on somebody with PTSD, they might really jump out of their skin for a second and have a really big reaction, like a startle reaction. That's a hyperarousal symptom. We also see hyperarousal affecting emotions. So folks who have a lot of hyperarousal tend to have more anger or anger outbursts where they all of a sudden get really, really upset with people. And you can see this is also a symptom of BPD. So you can start to see how like PTSD and BPD start to sort of play together and interact because there's a lot of overlap in the symptoms, including this next one, that folks with BPD or PTSD often feel like they have persistent negative emotions. They're really just feeling kind of distressed and emotional a lot of the time. It's probably obvious how this would affect our relationships, right? Our family members. But when folks are more angry or when they're on guard, there's often more conflict in those relationships related to that. People often find that the person with BPD can feel kind of controlling. You know, if they're on guard, if they kind of need to do a lot of things very particularly for them to feel safe, that can kind of spill out in terms of how they relate to or control the family members. They want them to sit in a specific place in the restaurant or say specific things, drive in specific ways, depending on the trauma. And of course, when somebody is on guard, when somebody has a lot of negative emotions, when there's anger, it can just be hard to feel close to people, right? There's just like a sense of difficulty with closeness that come with some of these symptoms. So we have our intrusive symptoms, making people re-experience trauma, the hyperarousal symptoms, like this constant state of arousal that the body gets put into in the wake of those intrusive symptoms. And those two things are so unpleasant that they lead to our third group of symptoms, which is called the avoidance symptoms. These are also very, very typical symptoms in PTSD. So avoidance symptoms are, again, what they sound like: people doing things to avoid being reminded of the trauma, to avoid thinking about the trauma, having feelings related to the trauma. So those could be things like external things, like avoiding certain people, places. I don't go to this place where I was attacked. But also avoiding thinking certain things, trying to avoid particular memories. And there's all kinds of ways people can avoid those internal sensations: alcohol, overwork, risky behavior like driving really fast or recklessly, impulsive shopping. And once again, for those of you who are familiar with borderline personality disorder criteria, you might again notice a bit of an overlap here, right? Avoidance symptoms play a really big role in relationships with family members and partners. One thing that a lot of family members of people with PTSD end up doing is something we call accommodation, which is working around avoidance in some way. So it's natural to have our loved ones, to not want our loved ones to feel distressed, to want to take their distress away. So if I know if my loved one survived a car accident, and now whenever we get into a car, if they have to drive, they get really, really like upset and panicky, like they have an intrusive symptom, basically, then maybe I'll start to drive for them. Maybe I'll start to say, you know what, I'm going to drive. You sit in the passenger seat. That's more comfortable for you. It's perfectly reasonable and understandable how it happens. But it's actually a form of accommodation, because what we're starting to do is sort of work around the avoidance. And so family members can start to get pulled in to playing a role in facilitating this avoidance. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about why, when we're treating PTSD, we don't want that, why we think that's not such a good thing, even though it's perfectly understandable the way it starts to happen, a lot of accommodation. Other forms of accommodation, family members might feel like, oh, we can't talk about certain things. We just make sure we don't bring those things up. Or we make sure that, you know, I'm always with them when they go into a crowded place or stuff like that. Those are all kinds of forms of kind of a form of avoidance that affects multiple people. And then the last group of symptoms is a group by many names. I call it numbing, but it's also got like jargonier names like negative alterations of cognitions and mood. But essentially, this is this group of symptoms that involves people kind of freezing or hunkering down in the wake of trauma. You know, as I said, those intrusive symptoms and hyperarousal symptoms are so uncomfortable that one thing that people start to do, not on purpose, it kind of just happens, is they start to freeze a little bit. We think it's a way to escape distress, but they start to kind of numb out in the wake of trauma. But the problem is that numbing doesn't just get rid of our positive emotions, but or our negative emotions. It gets rid of our positive emotions too. So folks who are experiencing a lot of numbing might say that they have difficulty feeling anything at all. They don't feel a lot of negative emotions, but they also just don't feel a lot of joy. They don't feel a lot of connection. They don't feel interested in the things that they used to be interested in. Hobbies don't feel as fun. Things don't feel as meaningful. That's also a symptom you see a lot in depression, which occurs a lot with PTSD. But that's what a lot of folks will describe here. They'll say they feel disconnected from their loved ones, from their family members, from their friends. And I think it's probably kind of obvious how that might affect our relationships, right? Like, when emotion is the glue that holds our relationships together. Emotion is what gives us intimacy, helps us feel close and connected to each other. When we don't have a lot of emotion, we don't have a lot of connection. So a lot of people, I work with a lot of couples where one person has PTSD or BPD, and a lot of couples, especially in the context of PTSD, say like there's just like an intimacy that's being lost a little bit. So all four of those, so that's the four symptom groups. We have the intrusive symptoms, the hyperarousal, the avoidance, and the numbing. And then all of those impact our relationships. And then our relationships, as I mentioned, kind of feedback and impact all of those symptoms. So that is PTSD. So let's go back to the trauma idea then, now that we've established that a little bit. So the first thing that I want to say is, like, trauma, as I said, affects almost everybody. So there are very stringent definitions of trauma that are quite extreme. So things like being exposed to sexual violence, threatened death, serious injury. As I said, it's kind of controversial whether or not those are the only things that count as trauma. A lot of people have different thoughts and feelings about that. But even if you're adopting those really extreme definitions, 90% of us are going to experience something like that, or have it happen to somebody that we're close to, or see it happen to somebody else. So it's very, very common. It's unfortunate, but it's common. PTSD is much less common. About 8 to 9% of the population will have PTSD at some point in their life. So if we think about PTSD as being caused by trauma, that raises a pretty important question, which is like, well, like, why is it that most people aren't getting PTSD after trauma? And what we essentially know is that, in a way, we do actually almost all get PTSD after trauma. But if you look at this graph, this y-axis here is sort of PTSD symptoms, and on the x-axis is just the passage of time. What we see for most people who experience trauma is that you do have some PTSD symptoms after the trauma, but in the weeks or months following the trauma, they tend to sort of recover on their own. So we call that process natural recovery. And you might have had that experience. You know, maybe you got into something, you know, had a car accident or something, and maybe you were shaky, maybe you had some nightmares, maybe you felt kind of jumpy for a few weeks or a few months, but over time kind of just went away on its own. We call that natural recovery. And that's a course that we see for a lot of folks. When people have PTSD, they look like this yellow line here. They also have PTSD symptoms after trauma, but they don't recover. So we think about PTSD as a disorder of stalled recovery. In a way, there's nothing unusual about the symptoms. The problem is that the symptoms haven't recovered. Something has gotten people stuck in the natural recovery process. And so our job is to figure out, as clinicians, is to figure out what's getting this person stuck and get it out of the way so that that natural recovery process can occur. I kind of think about it like there's like a dam in the river, you know, and we're trying to kind of get that out of the way so that natural recovery process can start flowing again. All right, so that's PTSD, regardless of BPD. That's PTSD in a nutshell. So now let's talk about what happens when PTSD meets BPD. So I've talked a little bit about how common that occurrence is. And part of that is we know that rates of trauma exposure in folks with BPD are actually quite high. We know that when we treat BPD with our standard BPD treatments like dialectical behavior therapy, PTSD doesn't really get better. It does for some folks, which is great, but for most people who have PTSD, it doesn't tend to get better on its own. So what happens if we treat BPD or PTSD? What happens to the BPD symptoms? That is an empirical question, a question that's being researched extensively right now. There's a little bit of research that suggests that perhaps treating PTSD might have downstream effects on the BPD. It might help that get better. But right now, there's a range of different treatments that are approaching this in a range of different ways. And I'm going to talk to you about all those treatments in a minute. I put in some slides last minute on complex PTSD, seeing that there were going to be some questions about that. And this is a term and a phrase that comes up a lot in this field. So this question of like, well, how does complex PTSD, how does CPTSD, complex trauma, interface with all these different terms? What complex PTSD is a concept that has been put forth starting in the early 90s, but more recently in the last decade or so, that suggests that it's a specific form of PTSD that particularly comes from early trauma that has been repeated and involves relationships. So constant, chronic physical abuse in childhood would be an example of that. And complex PTSD theoretically involves having both the classic PTSD symptoms that I just talked about, plus dysregulated emotions, so intense, quickly changing, sensitive emotion processes, disrupted relationships like conflict, what are called cognitive difficulties, like a changed sense of self, for example, like problems with one's identity, problems with sometimes being present. So dissociation is a phenomenon where people can kind of feel like they're not in their body anymore, or they shift to another state of consciousness or something like that. And then depending on who you talk to, complex PTSD can also involve what's called behavioral dysregulation, as in things like self-harm, risky, self-damaging, or impulsive behaviors, and sometimes involves something called somatization, which involves kind of physical bodily complaints or pains. For those of you who are familiar with the borderline personality disorder criteria, you might notice that a lot of those seem to be very similar to the borderline personality disorder criteria. So borderline personality disorder criteria also lists emotion dysregulation, problems in relationships, the cognitive difficulties, and the externalizing or behavioral dysregulation, as in the impulsive, self-damaging behaviors. For that reason, complex PTSD as a diagnosis has become somewhat controversial in the field. In fact, I'm not actually sure what diagnostic tool is used in Australia, but in North America, we predominantly use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM. Do you use the ICD or yes? Okay. So there's these two systems, I'll just say there's these two systems that we use to kind of identify diagnoses. And in the one that we use in North America, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, complex PTSD has not been recognized as a formal diagnosis. That doesn't mean it's not real. It means that those researchers have determined that there's not enough evidence to include it at this point. And the reason is because there's mixed data with respect to whether complex PTSD is actually a different category than just having BPD and PTSD. Other people say it is maybe the same thing, but it's a better term for it. Other people say, no, it's a uniquely different diagnosis and presentation. I'm not here to kind of like push one argument or another. That's the state of the field right now. My point is that the jury from the research perspective at this point is kind of out on this diagnosis. So it's not a formal diagnosis per the DSM. However, other countries use something called the ICD to diagnose, and it is a diagnosis in the ICD. So it kind of depends on where you are in the world at this point. I think that the most important takeaway when it comes to complex PTSD, I mean, you can get really stuck in the like, well, what is it? Is it different from BPD PTSD? Is it not? Is it the same? How's it different? I think those are important questions. But I think the more important question is, if you have phenomena that are aligned with complex PTSD, what do we do about it? And the answer to that is that the data suggests that our standard PTSD treatments work just as well for folks with complex PTSD as folks who have, simple PTSD. So folks with this diagnosis or this presentation can certainly respond to and benefit from PTSD treatments, which is good news. And of course, I have to say, there's no such thing as simple PTSD. I can tell you that for sure. PTSD is never simple. All right, so let's talk then about what approaches do we have to treating BPD and PTSD and or complex PTSD, depending on how we want to kind of talk about these labels. There's sort of three different options in our midst. We have the BPD treatments, the trauma-focused treatments, and treatments that combine the two. I'm not going to talk about BPD treatment as in treatment for BPD that has nothing to do with PTSD today, because I think that's like another talk, but many of you are probably familiar with like dialectical behavior therapy, mentalization-based therapy, what are our kind of frontline BPD treatments. So I'm going to leave those alone. I've already told you that the data suggests that PTSD doesn't really respond so well to those. So let's talk about trauma-focused treatments instead. So there's many trauma-focused treatments out there. This is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. I wanted to show you two of the treatments that have the most evidence behind them, which is prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy. And one I just want to mention because I think there's a lot of family members in the room the virtual space, is a treatment that my colleague developed called cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, or CBCT, which is delivered to somebody with PTSD and a family member or significant other at the same time. Like I said, with kind of a 3-for-1 goal of treating PTSD, enhancing relationship functioning, and improving the mental health or well-being of that family member, all in one treatment. And data suggests that it is effective in doing that. So it was initially designed for couples, but it's been used for all kinds of family members at this point. And I believe there's a website called Couple Therapy for PTSD, where you can learn more about that if that's of interest. I can double check the website at the end of this. So that one has not been studied as much as these other two. These top two have been studied extensively. However, it does have a considerable amount of evidence, and it brings in those relationship elements that I've been referring to. So I thought it was kind of an honorable mention. Okay, prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy. Let's talk a little bit about those. So how does prolonged exposure work? So the central idea behind prolonged exposure is that people develop these things called fear structures after they get traumatized, and the fear structures contain inaccurate information. So fear structures are these ideas, these networks of things in our minds that help us respond quickly in dangerous situations. So let's say I'm swimming and I see a shark, and a dangerous type of shark. Now, I live in Canada, so I have zero shark exposure. So I don't really know which sharks are, maybe y'all will know better. What's the good shark or the bad? I changed this from bears because with bears, you always have to do different things. But you tell me, I see the bad shark, scary shark, and that activates my shark fear structure. So that involves a couple things, like the stimuli or the information that's going to activate it. Like, that's a shark. Whoa. The physiological body responses that should come with that, like my heart rate increases, I have the urge to swim away, and some meaning making element, some thought, like, this is really dangerous, I have to get away from this shark. Okay, that makes a lot of sense, right? Like, if I am swimming and that gets activated, that's going to help me respond really quickly to a threat. However, oh, sorry, I accidentally advanced my slide. However, it doesn't make so much sense if that same fear structure, that same mental representation is getting activated, not in response to a actual dangerous shark, but a picture of a shark. Like, you show me a picture and I have this huge heart rate increase and I think this is really dangerous, because it's not dangerous. I'm just looking at a picture, right? So if we think about this in the context of trauma, when folks are actually experiencing trauma, these fear responses are adaptive and appropriate. But when they are no longer experiencing a trauma, and now they have a memory of the trauma or a smell that reminds them of the trauma, but the same fear response is getting activated, it is no longer helpful, right? It's now getting activated in unhelpful ways in response to inaccurate information. And so it becomes kind of what we call overgeneralized, like it's getting overly sensitive and then reacting to all kinds of information that is not actually dangerous, right? Memories are uncomfortable, but they're not dangerous. And avoidance, when people start to avoid things that remind them of the trauma, they avoid thinking about the trauma, tends to keep this going because it prevents those fear structures from getting updated. So if every time I see a picture of a shark, I close my eyes and look away really quickly, I might feel less upset by that. Like, I might feel calmer after I do that, but I don't get my kind of mind and body the opportunity to learn, like, oh, if I just looked at that picture and nothing bad happened to me, I would learn that that's actually not dangerous. This fear structure doesn't need to get activated here. But because I'm always avoiding, I don't actually learn that. And so then the responses just keep going. So avoidance in PTSD really feeds PTSD. It makes a lot of sense why people avoid, but it does a lot to keep it going. So based on that, from a prolonged exposure perspective, the treatment involves activating this fear structure, exposing people to the things that bring on this reaction that are not trauma, that are objectively safe, and then allowing this updated information to be integrated. So what that literally looks like is usually purposely remembering the trauma, going through the memories that people tend to avoid, usually many, many times, and purposely doing things that they would avoid in their real life because of the trauma that are safe. So I don't mean like, oh, go talk to a perpetrator. Like, I mean like, oh, there's a smell you avoid. There's a song you avoid. Let's work on those things. So that people can start to have those corrective experiences that start to teach them and teach their mind really, this fear reaction is maybe there originally to keep you safe, but we don't actually need it. We don't need it here. So that's how prolonged exposure tends to work. Cognitive processing therapy is another treatment for PTSD that does do some of those things and doesn't disagree with anything that I've just said, but it focuses more on the way people make meaning of trauma, the way we understand why did this happen to me? What does this mean about me? What does this mean about the world? What does this mean about other people? With the idea that sometimes when we're trying to understand these very difficult to understand experiences, our brain kind of twists around them in ways that gets us stuck. Like when we get really focused on self-blame, or really focused on maybe changing all of our beliefs about the world in ways that aren't helpful, like, nobody can be trusted, everybody is out to get me. These kinds of ways that we start to understand things that actually start to feed into PTSD, that's really the focus of cognitive processing therapy. I have this bullet of just world belief because a lot of us are taught when we're kids that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. That's how we learn rules, really, like, hey, if you do that bad thing, like a bad thing, you're going to get in trouble. And so we kind of learn these rules even without knowing them. And that's great. But then when a trauma happens to us, it kind of creates some conflict in our own minds around like, how do we now make sense of the fact that like a bad thing happened to me? And that kind of process of trying to reconcile and understand that is where, again, these like meaning-making processes can kind of get stuck. So this treatment focuses on finding where those stuck points are in the meaning-making process and how people are talking about and telling the story of what happened and helping them to change their meaning, make sense of this in a way that allows them to heal. That's accurate and helpful. That's a little abstract, but one of my mentors and colleagues did an episode on the podcast This American Life, where the host of the podcast had PTSD and underwent this particular treatment with her. And the episode is called 10 Sessions. So if you want to go listen, like literally listen to what these sessions look like, you actually can on this podcast, which is, I think, kind of cool. Just some takeaways I want to say about trauma processing, then I'll briefly talk about the comorbidity, and then I will answer some questions. Most of the treatments that are the really gold standard treatments for PTSD do involve some kind of trauma processing. And so what I mean by that is they involve, approaching things that we usually avoid, thinking about the trauma, talking about the trauma in new ways, because of that role of avoidance is so toxic to PTSD that usually we want to target avoidance in some way. Many clinicians and researchers at this point feel that folks with BPD or borderline personality disorder, folks need to be ready for trauma processing. Like they need to have a low risk of suicide. They need to have skills to regulate difficult emotions. They can't have self-injure. They can't be attempting suicide. And there's increasing people testing that assumption, like, do we need to wait for folks to do these treatments, or can we just give them to people right away when they really need them? We really don't know the answer. That research, I'm doing some of that research right now to try and figure that out, because we want these treatments to get to people as quickly as they can. So I think that's a question. We think that there's a little bit of evidence that suggests we might be able to do that, but it's preliminary. So we need to do a lot more testing on that. And so last, that brings me to these combined treatments that are really designed for folks who have like chronic suicide, problems with suicide or self-injury or borderline personality disorder, and they have PTSD. So what do we do for those folks? Two of the treatments that are particularly big in this area that have been developed are called DBT-PE, dialectical behavior therapy, prolonged exposure, and DBT PTSD, which is very alphabet soupy. All I'm going to say about these is DBT-PE was developed by Melanie Harned in Seattle, and it takes prolonged exposure, which I've already described, and essentially adds it onto DBT. And essentially people get standard dialectical behavior therapy, and they can begin the PE part, the prolonged exposure part, once they're not at like imminent risk of suicide, once they haven't self-harmed or attempted suicide in the past 2 months, they can control their self-harm a little, enough to do the trauma work. They want to work on their PTSD. There's no serious problems that are interfering with therapy, and they're willing to experience painful trauma-related emotions. And if folks do not yet meet those criteria, then they work in DBT to get there so they can begin the prolonged exposure work. And the data for DBT PE has been fantastic. Compared to DBT alone, the remission rates, as in the extent to which people no longer have PTSD, are double. Folks who get this treatment compared to DBT alone are also 2.4 times less likely to attempt suicide and 1.5 times less likely to self-harm. So it looks like this is good, not just for PTSD, but also for BPD. Like treating the PTSD is good for the BPD. All I'll say about DBT PTSD is that it also combines some elements of dialectical behavior therapy with some cognitive and prolonged exposure treatment elements. And again, they tend to offer this to people who haven't engaged in suicide attempts or suicidal behavior in the past few months. There's a couple trials out right now showing that this treatment tends to outperform other treatments in reducing PTSD symptoms. So again, it's a promising treatment. Both of these treatments are fairly new, but are certainly promising. And the take home that I think I take from that is that treating PTSD might be helpful to both PTSD and to BPD. I think it's an important thing to do. And historically, it used to get avoided. Because people assumed like, oh, we can't treat PTSD and borderline personality disorder. But these wonderful researchers are showing we can, and maybe we should. We now need to figure out how to get people those treatments. So that is kind of, again, coming into this area that I'm starting to study a little bit around, like how quickly can we treat PTSD for these folks? We need to get these treatments out to people as quickly as possible. Can we do the kind of standard PTSD treatments? Do we need to do the combined ones? When do we need to do the combined ones versus the sort of standard PTSD treatments? And can we do these things and treat relationships at the same time? Those are sort of the areas that I've been focusing on in my research. And I wish I could answer those questions, but I don't have the answers yet, but I will one day, and we are working on it. That's kind of what's coming down the pipeline for me, and I think for a lot of folks in the field as well. Maybe before I answer questions, I'll just say really quickly as my last plug, I know how painful these conditions are for folks who live with them and for your family members. They are treatable. And with each, year, we find more and more information about how we can treat them better, how we can treat them faster. I think there's so much reason to be hopeful out there about what can be done and how freeing these things really can be. I think people, when they feel liberated from their PTSD, it can be a truly transformative experience. And even if folks have had those PTSD treatments that I've mentioned and not gotten better, there are also more treatments out there that I didn't mention that are less researched, but still pretty well researched. So there's a lot out there, and I hope that can be a source of hope for folks. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and maybe we'll do some questions. All right, so I have some questions that were previously sent to us. So maybe I'll start with those. One of the first questions was, how does BPD present differently in young men compared to young women? And that's an excellent question. The research has been overly biased towards studying women with BPD for many reasons. Some folks, actually, due to bias, sometimes men with BPD are less likely to be diagnosed or diagnosed with something else. The data suggests that in general, men express more anger, and there might be more likely to be substance use problems compared to women. But as I said, there's been too much focus, not too much focus on women, not enough focus on men, and also gender non-binary folks with BPD. So we don't have comprehensive information about how they can present differently. That being said, the data that does exist suggests that higher rates of anger, higher rates of substance use problems are typical in men. Another question that came in is, what kind of like, is it a chicken and egg issue essentially? So can BPD cause trauma, which can lead to PTSD, or does trauma cause BPD, cause PTSD? Question. The answer to that is it depends. So a lot of folks can develop, trauma. One thing I meant to say is trauma can cause all kinds of problems. It doesn't just cause PTSD. People can get depressed in response to trauma. They can get anxious, and certainly trauma can play a role in leading to the development of borderline personality disorder as well. That being said, of course, when we engage in a lot of risky behavior, we also end up in situations where we might experience trauma more, and that can lead to PTSD. I want to be really clear about what I mean by that, which is not that anybody is to blame for getting PTSD or causes their own PTSD. It's more that we can end up in a vicious sort of cycle where we experience really painful emotions. We start to do things to deal with those emotions, like engage in a lot of substance use or other kinds of risky behaviors that then, by virtue of being in those environments, have a higher risk of being exposed to trauma. And then people can be more exposed to PTSD. That can happen. But what we've seen most commonly is that trauma can play a role in the development of both PTSD and BPD. I'm going to just quickly, there was another question around what assessments are used to properly diagnose BPD and PTSD. There's a range of different assessments. There's standardized assessments that people can use that are kind of studied as particularly good. They need to be administered by a professional. In my province, only psychologists and people with MDs can diagnose, medical doctors can diagnose. But usually like an assessment should involve a clinical interview, and I don't think you can diagnose BPD or PTSD in 5 minutes. So a lot of folks have had those experiences where they saw a doctor for like 2 minutes and then all of a sudden BPD is in their chart. I would not say that that is an evidence-based or reliable assessment. It usually involves interviewing people for a while to get a sense of their life history. Okay, I'm going to answer some of the chat questions that are coming in. How to help when the trauma is ongoing and lifelong, right? So, i.e. medical. Okay, I'm glad you clarified that. So yeah, so if somebody is in a trauma environment where there's like literally a lack of safety, like they are actively being abused, for example, probably our first priority is getting them out of an environment like that to one where they're safe before we even think about treating PTSD. Although there have been some studies that show that you can treat PTSD in environments where people are still actively experiencing trauma. Usually that's not the typical approach that I've seen. When it is a medical trauma or like an intense stressor, usually people need a treatment. People can be treated for PTSD symptoms, but also might need psychotherapy that just helps them cope with the stressor as they experience it, find ways to have a meaningful life alongside those stressors. And there are a range of treatments that are designed for that. Acceptance and commitment therapy is a really good example of a treatment that is made for people who experience a fair amount of pain, physical pain, that really focuses on how people can live alongside the pain in ways that reduce their suffering if they can't control that. So hopefully that's helpful. What's your perspective and experience / knowledge of trauma, classification of what is trauma? Oh, okay, I get it. That controversy I alluded to around like what is traumatic, what is not. I don't have a perspective on that, to be honest. I used to, but I don't, because I think, there's some data, for example, that like infidelity, finding somebody cheating on you can be traumatic, but it's not captured in the DSM as a trauma. And a lot of people feel really invalidated by that. And then, then people, can really expand the definition, and some people argue to contract it. For me, I'm not that interested in the debate because I think it can be like a weird debate around like, well, how valid is your suffering? And it's just kind of like distracting. For me, what's important is, do you have PTSD symptoms? Not like, do you have re-experiencing symptoms? Do you have like intrusive symptoms? Do you have avoidance symptoms? If so, I want to treat your PTSD. If not, I may want to treat you, and maybe we'll work on the trauma you experienced or the stressor you experienced, but you don't need a PTSD treatment if you don't have PTSD. You might need some other kind of treatment. For me, that's like the key focus there. The other thing is that I think that a lot of folks feel like if they don't use the term trauma, it invalidates their experience of how powerfully impactful the stressor was. And I think it's really important to acknowledge to people that we can be really damaged and hurt and impacted by all kinds of experiences, regardless of whether or not they fit into a particular box. And I think we need to validate that for folks. What about when people with BPD and PTSD become addicted to meth? Yeah, so substance use problems are highly associated with both borderline personality disorder and PTSD. There's a lot of folks who have all three of those conditions. There have been many studies looking at how to treat PTSD and substance use problems at the same time, not with BPD in the mix, but maybe that's coming down the line. And what those studies generally suggest is that treating PTSD can improve both substance use problems and PTSD, but treating substance use alone without treating the PTSD, it's not necessarily the reverse direction. That's not necessarily true. So there's treatments out there. Actually, Catherine Mills, who's a phenomenal researcher in Australia, worked with others to develop a treatment called COPE, like COPE, which combines prolonged exposure with substance use treatment, which has some really great data for those problems. What suggestion? Wow, there's so many great questions. What suggestion for helping a loved one move from mindset of total dependence on medication to embarking upon therapy? Yeah, that's a very hard situation. I can only imagine how difficult that is. It's very hard. I mean, I would give the suggestion if I had like the clear suggestion at the top of my head. I understand why you're asking the question. It's hard to give an answer to that in the abstract without knowing the specific person. Because I think that ultimately probably that involves like a lot of validation and the skills that are taught in family connections to help people navigate those difficult conversations with their loved ones with BPD. There is not a medication for PTSD or BPD that is as evidence-based as dialectical behavior therapy, for example. So we can share that information and we can use our family connection skills to be as validating as possible. And we can maybe ask them to speak to their doctors and medical providers about that so they can receive that information from other sources. And then we can probably practice radical acceptance. That's really hard to control another person, and I think that's a very difficult position to be in. My 34-year-old daughter insists that DBT is no longer gold standard treatment for BPD and not helpful. What do you think about that? Also, there has been some research into the use of EFT or tapping for PTSD. Do you think it would be helpful for BPD? DBT is the gold standard treatment for BPD. It is. That doesn't mean that it's helpful for everybody. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. Some people will not benefit from dialectical behavior therapy. I think it's a really good thing to try first. But if you don't benefit from dialectical behavior therapy, that does not mean that you cannot benefit from something. There are other treatments that have been studied for BPD: mentalization-based therapy, transference-focused therapy, schema-focused therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. They have not been studied as much. It doesn't mean they're not as good. It means they're not as studied. So, if I have a illness, I want to try first the thing that the most science suggests works. But if that doesn't work for me, and it won't work for everybody, then I'm going to try something else. And I think that's totally reasonable. And there will be people who benefit from other things. So I think that's important to acknowledge. Emotion-focused therapy is a therapy that has been studied a little for BPD and for PTSD and has some evidence. Tapping is popular for PTSD. It does not have the same level of empirical support as the scientific support as the treatments that I've been referring to. And to my knowledge, there's no science that suggests that it would work for BPD. Again, that doesn't mean it won't. It just means it's not studied. But I would want people to go the science-supported directions first, as a general rule. Would you suspect, I don't know much more time I have to answer questions, Belinda, so you can I'm usually just coming off. Or I'll just go all night.
Oh, we've got a few more minutes.
Okay, great. Would you suggest specific prolonged exposure courses to do professional development in? Ooh, I don't know if that's a clinician asking, but certainly Melanie Harned does trainings all the time in dialectical behavior therapy for prolonged exposure called DBT PE. I don't know who is offering prolonged exposure trainings, but there are many, and you could probably Google that and find some good workshops. The developer of PE is in Philadelphia, and her name is Edna Foa. And so I'm trying to remember what her center is called. I can't at the top of my head, but she's at University of Pennsylvania. So you could try there to see if there's any trainings being offered out of there. Is there much research on treatment for people who are experiencing ongoing trauma, such as current domestic violence relationship? Yeah, so that's kind of what I was referring to earlier. There's not a ton of research actually, because usually PTSD treatments require people to be outside of trauma, out of the trauma environment before they get PTSD treatment. And that is kind of what we think the safest gold standard practice are. Like I said, there are people who are trying to test these assumptions, like, oh, can we treat PTSD if somebody is in an ongoing traumatic environment? But those are still really new ideas. And right now, the primary approach would be to get out of the traumatic situation before experiencing a PTSD treatment, partially because we don't really know what's going to happen to PTSD symptoms until you're away from the trauma. You might have that natural recovery. They might resolve. Does meditation or breathing practice help self-harm? Certainly that's a skill that's taught and emphasized in dialectical behavior therapy. So it very much can. It may not be the sole thing that's required. And when to use that skill versus something else is a complex question that needs to be addressed probably with a therapist. Oh my gosh, there's so many more questions. I'm really sorry.
There's a couple of themes, Skye.
Yeah.
One of them is people are asking about, is it often that family members experience PTSD due to when one of the other family members has probably unregulated BPD?
Yeah, it's really interesting you ask that, because we are studying that in my lab right now. So with our colleagues who run Family Connections in Canada, we have been starting to study the experiences of family members. And we have found some elevated rates of PTSD related to that, related to trauma, like seeing a loved one, hurt themselves, or being in a physical fight that's really scary. We have seen that. It's almost not at all studied. And so we are in the process right now of working with our colleagues who run Family Connections groups in Canada to develop a trauma program that's going to be peer-led, so it can actually be delivered at scale. That's our hope, kind of like Family Connections, for family members who have PTSD related to these experiences with their loved one with BPD. So we're working on that right now, which is, I think, very important, very exciting, because right now nothing's been developed for those folks, but yes, it certainly can exist. And I have no reason to believe that if that is your situation, that you couldn't benefit from a PTSD treatment. Is there anything else you want me to answer?
There's probably one more theme that seemed to come up a few times is, how do we encourage someone with BPD or PTSD to seek professional support?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's always the question, right? Like, it's a very difficult thing to answer, because it probably depends on the person you have in mind and what they need, what they respond to. What I would say in the abstract, not knowing the answer to any of those questions, so as a very general rule, I think we want people to know that they don't have to live in the kind of pain they're in. Like, there is actually a world in which they are not afflicted with PTSD. Like, that is something that is really possible. And letting them know about those possibilities and options is, I think, really important for people to have hope. And then in terms of how to do it, I would say Family Connections offers the skills to help navigate some of those difficult conversations, right? It's going to teach you validation. It's going to teach you relationship mindfulness skills to help engage in some of these really challenging conversations for loved ones with BPD, that I think is going to be a really great resource. So can't recommend it enough. And I'm sure Belinda can attest to it as a Family Connections leader. So that's kind of my abstract, would be to work on those things in Family Connections if you can. And then, like I said, there's probably some radical acceptance that at the end of the day, all of our control over other people is somewhat limited.
That's right. I think that's all we've got time for in the questions. Thank you all for submitting your questions. Now, just before we say a really big thank you to Skye, I'd like to talk to you all a little bit more about our organisation. So as I mentioned earlier, we are a not-for-profit and we don't receive any funding from the government or any type of other funding other than donations from the public. We run all of our Family Connections programs for free, and they're run by and delivered by entirely by our amazing team of volunteer leaders across Australia. We would love if you would be able to consider sending us a donation so that we can reach more families across Australia and continue to provide our programs and our webinars and our events for free. We are truly very very grateful for your generosity. And that concludes our webinar today. Thank you so much for you all turning up. We hope you've enjoyed today's presentation and gained a little more knowledge on the subject of BPD and PTSD. Thank you to our wonderful presenter, Skye, for her dedication in this space and for her time to share her knowledge with us today. If you have any further queries or any questions about our programs, please send us an email, or we'll just pop the registration page up for our website. Sorry, I didn't have that available. And if you've got any further questions, you may email us at familyconnections@bpdaustralia.org. And we will attempt to answer as many questions as we can. We'll be running these webinars monthly, so we'll have some more wonderful speakers for you all. Thank you very much, Skye.
Thank you, everyone. I answered the EMDR question in chat, if that helps. So thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday. I'll enjoy the rest of my Friday.
Yes, you enjoy your Friday. Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Have a great day.